So how did you first get into tech?
Tim, I'm fairly old. That's an interesting question to answer because I guess when I got into tech, seriously, it was back in the 80s. I was writing assembler code on 6502 machine learning products, it's Commodore 64s. So look, it's probably not relevant for the audience as to how I first got into tech, because I think back then there was a tech industry in the sense that it was both a unique thing. It wasn't endemic across every sector, and it was quite unique and it was growing at the time. So I think maybe a better way to answer your question is kind of that moment where I realized what the tech industry actually is and what it means to be successful in it. Because I probably spent a good 15, 20 years of my time in the tech industry, just sort of in the bubble of it, selling tech to other tech people. I was selling, software to people that buy software. But I remember in 2014, I was working at Microsoft. I took a job in product management. And so, sort of stepping out of this sort of more traditional engineering, software development, consultative type work, stepped into product management in 2014. And at the time, the products were the IoT, the Internet of Things products that Microsoft were launching, and something called Project Oxford, which in turn turned out to be Microsoft's AI platform and ultimately became where they are today with OpenAI. But in that moment, and stepping into product management, what it opened up my eyes to realize is that the tech industry no longer exists. And the tech industry is, in fact, a part of every single industry in every single sector, because I was the product manager for this IoT suite. And we were starting to sell or bring that technology into the real world. And so the very first customer I had was actually a oyster farm company down in Tasmania that was trying to measure the salinity and the alkalinity of water to determine how oysters would grow, and so they manage that process. And it was that realization, that moment, that you kind of intersect that technology isn't just technology for the sake of technology. Technology as a role, as a job, as a career actually impacts how we all now live our lives, and all of the things. It impacts the food chain, it impacts the logistics, it impacts retail, it impacts everything. And so I guess it's sort of, for me, that moment was that realization that getting into tech industry is in every industry. What was most important to me then, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about this in subsequent questions, is what does the real world need from tech savvy, tech trained, or tech educated people in order to bridge that gap, to connect the dots? And sort of the tech industry became this translation industry. It became this, people in the tech industry had to become very adept at being able to translate technology into the real world. And so for me, that was almost like the rebirth into the reality of the tech industry, which is it only exists to help make our lives better. So wherever tech exists, it needs to kind of augment, improve, or bring something valuable to the real world. So yeah, I guess I fell into it in the early days, and I just discovered that it actually has purpose and meaning in more recent times.
I guess for those in non-technical roles or, haven't got a background in tech, what would you say to what would be the sort of single most important technical skill that they should learn or prioritize to sort of future-proof their job?
Well, that's you pick the one thing it's really tough. And the reality is it's probably not even specific to tech industry, but it's just about this capacity to operate in a world that is now so digitally enabled, so fast moving, so broad in its footprint, and in some places super deep, and in many places very thin. The thing that I have, and I've had to learn this myself, this isn't like just a thing that you learn as a student heading into the workforce. This is something I had to develop a skill for in the last sort of 5 or 10 years, is your ability to manage the situation as it is, but always be willing to accept changes in that situation. So we talk in terms of this, your ability to learn new things. We talk about being a learner at all culture. And that's one way of framing it, because it is about learning a lot, but it's almost being about this willingness to recognize that what you know today is not the answer for tomorrow, that there is always something that you can be taught, and your willingness to kind of go on that journey and continually evolve your learning and accept that technology is completely shifting the ways that things work is a really critical skill. Because it's, the longer you stay in the longer you build a particular capability around a skill, you tend to get very sort of myopic about the fact that that skill is what defines you. And I think in the modern world now, or at least my experience has been, and from Microsoft and certainly here in the government, is you are defined by your ability to adapt, not by your ability to do. And so I see so much more of this ability to kind of shapeshift, if you like, around things. And coupled with that, it isn't just about that kind of constantly being able to move through it. It's being able to assimilate information very quickly, to understand, to sort of grok the world that is forming around you, and then be able to operate within that. And that's, it seems logical. These things like what we would call soft skills in the old days, this sort of, this just your ability to read rooms and read people and understand it. But I think if you want a kind of a reality check, the soft skills are becoming the very important hard skills, and the hard skills are becoming very malleable and have to change over time because they move very quickly. So that to me is quite an interesting flip flop of focus and energy.
And you sort of said there wasn't a specific moment per se, but what prompted the decision to move into the Australian government and lead the National AI Centre?
Yeah, I sometimes wonder that myself. I'm really enjoying it. It's been a good experience. It's been a very different experience. So it was about 9, maybe coming up for a year actually now, where the moment first appeared to me. So just from a context point of view, I mean, I literally joined the tech industry properly in the early 90s. I joined IBM and sort of worked in their mainframe world and did that. Moved from IBM to a small startup. I went from a couple of startups to RSA Security, and then from RSA Security to Microsoft, Amazon, back to Microsoft, and here at the government. So my entire world up at this point was private sector, and frankly, the tech industry, IBM, RSA, Tivoli, Microsoft, Amazon, these are all big tech companies, some of which don't necessarily exist anymore. And I think what I found was, as I got a little bit older, a couple of things happened to you, is one of which is you start to realize that you are no longer the energy within the room. You are, there's a lot of young people coming up into this sector, in this industry, who bring a lot of energy, a lot of ideas. And you sort of start to realize that you're no longer the energy, but you are the experience. And your job sort of pivots from being a doer to helping other people do, and that's certainly what happens in most senior leadership roles. If you journey your way through any kind of role in any company, that sort of tends to be what the case is, that you're about building teams and helping people do the best work they can. And so I'd reached the point in Microsoft where I've been doing that for a long time. I was privileged to sit in this CTO role at Microsoft at a very important time. I was there through the OpenAI launch, through the moments around sort of ChatGPT, and then obviously the Copilot, and then I pivoted into this. And so the reason to do it is, and it seems a bit trite, but the reason to do it was actually to step into this role where I could build something that mattered, that had longevity. And I said that's not that the work at Microsoft and Amazon, all those other companies I've worked at, didn't matter. It matters in the microcosm of that company. Like, what you do there really matters to that company. It does at the time. But I've got a couple of children who are no longer children anymore, young adults, I've got one at university in second year uni and one just finishing school. And I sort of, for me, this was a moment of pivot to say, AI is having such a profound impact on the world. And I don't know how far you want to get into sort of AI specifically. I've been privileged to have this sort of front row seat to watch this moment come along. And I've seen a lot of interesting changes in my time. I watched the sort of the moment of mobile phone devices. I watched cloud computing. I watched hypervisors and virtualization. I watched, the sort of the power apps and the low code, no code moments. I've seen all of these things happen, and they've all been really sort of super interesting and fun to watch. But I've never seen anything like this, because this isn't fundamentally a technology shift. This is an entire sort of shift between the way that we as human beings interact with the technology that we've created. It changes that mechanism. And so I wanted to step into a role where I could shape that, not just for my young kids now, my children, but also for Australia, and to create something, because I have a sense of what I think is right, what I think is needed, what I think is important for us, as not just as a country, but, the opportunity that AI affords us as a society to kind of keep moving forward, solve many of the problems. And, you kind of, when the opportunity knocks on your door, and as it did for me, you sort of look at yourself and go, well, if I don't do this, what message am I sending to my kids? But also, why would I not do this? Who wouldn't want the opportunity to take the role in the front seat of Australia's National Centre for AI at a time like this, when AI is so pivotal? It was just a privilege to get the opportunity. So I don't know why I would have not taken it, but it's been a real challenge. Moving from private sector to public sector really pivots your point of view and how you think about things. You learn a lot about how the sausage is made in government, and how the reality of the process works. And that's interesting to learn. And now figuring out how to make what I think the National AI Centre needs to do happen is the goal in front of me.
That's awesome. And I understand there's been a lot of debate around what our sovereign AI strategy should look like. So whether we should build our own sort of foundational models or we should rely on existing models, whether that be in China or the US. How
Ah,
do you view that concept of sovereign AI strategy?
yeah, it's a good question. The word sovereign is an interesting word in this narrative, and it is for good reason. It has found its way into the way that the globe talks about AI. It's not just Australia looking at this; it's every country is asking this question about its sovereign strategy, and it's born out of two things. Like there's a history of the use of sovereign in a concept around national security, defense, intelligence, and this ability for the country to sort of defend itself as an individual, which is a different world. And then there's also, if you kind of, if you're observing the tech industry over the last 15 years, as the cloud industry grew, and again, back at that time in the early 2012, 2013, when Amazon launched S3 and then became Amazon Web Services, and then Microsoft launched what was internally called Project Red Dog, which became Azure. At that time, the conversations were actually quite mired in this topic of the Cloud Act. I don't know if you remember this, but this whole issue of, if we put this stuff in the cloud, suddenly there's this concentration effort going on. We're putting all of our eggs into this one basket. We've got, a handful of big tech companies that kind of are now owning this piece of infrastructure. And even then, we weren't calling it sovereign, but we were talking about this issue of, if I put my software, my services, my business products into this cloud run by a US tech company, does the US Cloud Act suddenly give them rights to do things they wouldn't have had if we just run it ourselves under our desks in the sort of traditional way? So this isn't a new thing, this sovereign issue, but it's become more important with AI because, as you know, the topic of AI is a very broad topic. We use the word AI as an adjective to describe something that is actually about, sort of 20 or 30 different technologies across a band of about 100 different kind of applications. It doesn't really help us define what we mean. And critically, AI has been deeply tied to issues of national security, and weapons, automated weapons, and biochemical development, and all of those sort of nasty sides of what we know, as well as all the good stuff. And so sovereign has crept into this AI thing. So to answer your question, look, I don't like the word sovereign if we say, do we need to have our own sovereign AI? Because it sort of leads us down this path towards saying, do we need to have a competitor to the other products out there? Do we need to invest hundreds of $billions as a country to build a better version of ChatGPT or OpenAI's model, GPT models, or Mistral's model, or Claude, or whatever your model is? And I think there's a sort of a false economy to that, which was born out in the cloud era because, we sort of saw this, do we need to build sovereign, versions of that? And economics don't play out. It's a business decision. So what I think we need, and I would absolutely stand behind, is we need to have access to a sovereign AI ecosystem that allows us to reach into that end-to-end supply chain of AI, which starts with models, but also starts with data, also starts with the research and the science about how to build models and where to evaluate and develop better and different models that meet our unique needs as a country, or allow our unique value to be exposed through the lens of AI, as well as the upstream stuff, building AI-based products or building products that are challenging market norms through the use of AI and all of that. So it's the ecosystem we need. And that's about investing in research, investing in people, investing in business, figuring out the data issues and how do we access the data, or what unique data do we have. So yeah, a sovereign ecosystem, yes, but do we need a model that is purely built on Australian knowledge? It's an interesting challenge with this one. And I remember when I was in the Microsoft role talking to this about other countries. If you as a country decide to build an AI model that is uniquely about your culture, your country, your language, and your data, then that model is only useful to you in a very limited context, wherever Australianism is a critical part of the narrative, which there are very few business scenarios where that's actually the case. A model that understands the world and understands the unique differences, but also can correlate between them, because what does AI do very well? It correlates massive data to create sort of simplified data points on that. So a model that actually has Australian contribution, but not Australian sovereignty, is a much more useful long-term vision for me than just sort of creating closed-door models that we have. But that's a different problem to the question of whether or not we should have compute power and research and scientists and the ability to build these things here. We absolutely should have that.
That's interesting. And I guess the with the issue faced with a lot of international laws, treaties, bodies, is although it is international, everyone can access it. There are sort of key players, usually the dominant economic powers, that have control over the way in which it's defined or governed. So that would be interesting, but formulating like how that looks, that is a challenge. I think the National AI Center also has touched on this point of there being these sort of 25 dense clusters of opportunity within AI in Australia. What are the primary challenges facing businesses within these specific sectors to sort of integrate AI currently?
There's a couple of things in your question there. I mean, there's the challenge of how do we as a country kind of get integrated and start using AI in meaningful ways. There's the issue of the distribution of our country and where the opportunity sits. And then even going back to your point you made about sort of in spite of all of these sovereign intentions, there is a sort of a cohort of very large organizations that are spending all the millions of dollars on building these things out. And if I just from a lens of the audience for this, thinking about students and those looking to build a career in this industry, and even though I said earlier on there's no industry, getting skilled in these technologies so that you can service the world in different industries and different sectors. There's sort of two sides to this large clustering through the big tech companies. Obviously, on one side, it does create an imbalance of power, and we've seen this conversation played out both geopolitically as well as politically. Who's really in control here, and how much power do they wield, and the issues there. And social media has been a great sort of test bed to demonstrate just where those challenges lie. But I think for those of you seeking to develop career paths that lean into this, those big companies and the fact that they are so invested in Australia, all three of the big three, if you think about Google, Amazon, Microsoft as being sort of the big three cloud, all three are multi-billion-dollar invested in Australia, which creates jobs, creates opportunity, creates pathways for individuals to sort of do rapid learning. Because for whatever one of the advantages of having that concentration of investment is big problems get solved and big opportunities get created. So if you're developing a career path, those companies, and I've, having worked with them, they create great opportunities for you to rapidly develop a skill set and then find your path into almost any other sector, that across the country that you want to take those skills to. So, sort of, you can almost see them as that sort of that pathway. But and what that then leads to is this: they become an engine to create homegrown innovation. And we see this quite a lot. Students and founders and startups, kind of going through the mill of the big tech and kind of getting access to exposure to, and then startups and creating their own businesses and creating their own startups. And I hope most of your listeners ultimately find themselves on this path to be startups and founders in Australia, because that's what we need more of, is much more of that innovation here and staying here and building up in this country. So that does lead to the distribution and the density issue that, sort of the clusters we have. It's interesting, and having this conversation with someone yesterday about this, because Australia, if you kind of look at the numbers, our AI ecosystem is largely growing. We are seeing more and more companies either adopt, build, or innovate with AI in Australia. We aren't seeing, we have access to all the computers. It's not like we don't have access to these technologies. Like I just said, we've got access to cloud compute and scale. We've got access to the very latest GPUs here in the country. Some would argue they're not sovereign because they're run by another company, but ultimately they're here. So we've got all of these things, but we don't have that sort of that central pull, that gravity that we see Silicon Valley creates or Shenzhen creates in China, or in other regions that have that. And I think that's one of the challenges of Australia, is because we are so scaled and distributed, it's hard to see the big picture for us as a country. We know we've got the Harrison AIs and the Heidi AIs and the Canvas and all these companies, and there's the sort of the unicorns and amongst the many. But if you look across at Australia and go, where would you go if you were going to start your startup, or where would you found your business to get access to talent, resources, and all the things you need? It's hard to say because it's distributed so much across metro cities and then sort of Perth West mining clusters and biomedical up in Queensland and so on. So it does lead us to this problem of, from an outside looking in, if we want more investors to come here and build in Australia, this sort of distribution creates a bit of a challenge because it's hard to see where to go and what the center of the gravity is. And then to your last point about the AI integrator and how do we move forward, this is probably unlocking a bigger conversation. So it's something I talk about a lot in guiding and leading the National AI Center and the team there is, I think fundamentally we have a role to do three things, which will take Australia from being, I won't say the word laggard because that seems overly critical, but more cautious and less willing to take some of those risks that we see other sectors are. And it's three simple things, and it's clarity, capability, and confidence. And I think what we lack today in Australia, for whatever reason, is we don't have good clarity about what AI can and can't do. We have a predominance of clarity, what it will do bad, but we don't have a lot of clarity on what it will offer for us. We don't spend enough time looking at that. So we need clarity on that, and then, obviously how to achieve that. Capability leads into skilling, development, and resource fluency. Like, we're not as a people looking at this going, I want to explore this more. I want to learn what this can do and can't do because I want to understand the boundaries of it. Because once I understand the boundaries of it, I feel more confident, and that's that third C, confident. I will feel more confident. So I think if we can do that, and core to that is this balanced narrative. Like, how do we make sure that every Australian student, small business owner, large business owner, parent, grandmother, CEO, everyone has this balanced view that says AI, when done badly, has these potential risks, and here's the guidance on how to manage them. But when you manage those risks, you could unlock this opportunity, create this space, solve this problem, optimize your work process in a different way. Like, we don't have both sides of that conversation. So that to me, and that's kind of the role of the National AI Center, and it sort of goes back to your point about why did I join, because I want to bring that balance to the conversation. I want to have us be able to talk more about both sides of the equation for AI.
So although you speak about the opportunities here within Australia, the theme of founders seeing Australia as too small, or the capital markets being too small for their vision, a common one. How would you respond to that sentiment?
Look, it's a fair point. I mean, it's certainly the data demonstrates this clearly, that whilst we do have it, it's proportionately lower than it should be. Something called the SURD report, so Strategic Inquiry into Research and Development in Australia, was released. And this kind of shines a light on this fact that it uses the phrase ambitious Australia, because what sort of colloquially points to is that we've lost that ambition, that willingness to just go that bit further than before. And there's a sort of almost a reticence and a nervousness or a risk aversion that is holding us back and preventing us as a country from taking that step. So you raised this interesting point about kind of, if we're going to step out of this, we've got to do something different. And there's a few things in that mix. There's three things we can look at. Our school system, our education system still churns out a high percentage per capita of, super intelligent, smart people who could found businesses. Our university system is pretty well known for creating entrepreneurs, innovators, and the like. So how do we get them? How do we make it incentivizing for them to stay here and do their startup here? Then we've got all of those people that are either overseas as expats or, super smart people that we want to bring. We want to attract their businesses to come and establish base here and build here. And then in the middle of that is this cohort of all of those super smart people that are now, high demand, machine learning, data scientists and all of that. Like, how do we get more of them here? How do we build the talent pool that is needed here? And that's framing it. Those are the three challenges. For me, the most important challenge is building an environment across, the number of factors: tax, R&D, incentives, opportunity to market, VC funding, all the things. Creating an environment that is conducive to a startup founder wanting to stay in Australia because it's good for their business, good for their startup, and they can build the business of their dreams here. And that largely comes down to a couple of things, one of which you've already mentioned, which is, market size. Australian market size is smaller than the US or China or, European markets, and that's never going to be different. We're just a smaller market, but we can unlock more of our market. We can get more of our market working with startups. One of the blockers we see right now is many of our large-scale domestic organizations don't know quite how to engage startups. They don't know how to bring startups into their enterprise business, because startups tend to be scrappy and, idea-based, and enterprises tend to be structured and regulatory-based. So figuring out how to bridge some of those gaps. How do we help the two of them convene a language that creates a space where they can come together. That's a little bit of what the National AI Centre tries to do, is convene those spaces where those people come together. A point I made earlier is about a concentration of place. So if you are a founder in Australia, or you're a founder, you're leaving university, you've got an idea, you think you can found a business, you need to get funding. So where do you go to get VC funding? That's sort of distributed and tends to be distributed based on sort of states prefer to. Some states are good at some things and other states think they're better at other things. So we see space in Adelaide, we see health up in Queensland, see quantum here in New South Wales, and then it's not just that, but that kind of view. And then the last thing is that we'll hold because any startup that gets down that path and says, okay, I can see where I want to start it. I can get VC funding in Australia to get my business started. We know ultimately they will have to service some foreign market to capture the market scale they need, but they can stay based here. Then the last challenge is talent. How do I get all the people I need to be here and pay the salaries I need them? That's the challenge. And what needs to happen there is actually may seem counterproductive, but what we actually need to create in Australia is a highly competitive, highly dynamic ecosystem of AI businesses that are fighting each other to retain talent, because what it creates is that wage comparative to US. It creates an exciting environment where if you're skilled up and you've got knowledge and data, you're in the particular domain, there's a world you want to be in because they're trying to solve interesting problems and they're paying equivalency to what you might get overseas. So you sort of have to create this. You have to solve all those little problems, and then what will happen is the talent will come back because we'll become an attractive place to do it. So it's not by any means a silver bullet, but I think it's doable. I think these things are not outside of the scope of both industry as well as government, because there's two pieces to that, and academia and the student base that are listening here, because you've got industry has the money and the capital to invest in innovation and startups, and they need innovation ideas because big industry needs to keep building new things to sell to you. Government can invest in kind of creating the mechanisms and the operating environment to make that work. And then the student cohort or those people graduating with their great ideas need to be aware of this opportunity and kind of give it a chance.
So you've also spoken about assurance in the past being a foundation to our integration. How do you respond to concerns that complex assurance or sort of red tape is what a lot of these startups and also massive corporations find to be stifling their growth and innovation?
Yeah, look, it's a perennial problem of any sort of balance of equitable investment. So what you're describing is the problem we have today, which is everybody wants the big tech companies, to be much more contained in terms of their use of data, privacy, and how they handle people's data, and sort of the power that they have. So there's an imbalance of that power. So general society will say to the question of AI, it needs more governance. We want more assurance that AI is actually being safely deployed and managed, and we want these big companies regulated, and we want this environment to be locked down so that there's no harm that can be caused. And on the flip side, of course, we also want higher wages, more jobs, access to more innovation, better lifestyle. I want all those things. So we're in this weird dichotomy that everybody wants us to be safer, but also wants us to explore what can be done to make things better. And these are in contradiction. There's a really great saying from a lady who it's often attributed to an admiral in the US Navy, Grace Hopper. And she made this comment about the fact that all ships are safe when they're in a harbor, but that's not what ships are designed to do. And it kind of talks to this point that if you put red tape on everything and stop everything from being risky, then of course there is no risk and everything is safe and everything is good. But you're just sitting there, not going anywhere. You're not improving, and I'm not an economist. I don't have the data in front of me, but many will tell you that over the last sort of 20 years, whilst our economy has perceivably grown, actually it's no better than where we were. And there's, lots of arguments around kind of the challenges of progression and getting better, where we're getting better lives for every Australian. So in the context of AI, the challenge we're faced with is, yes, we understand that the risks of AI need to be explored, understood, and managed. No question about that. And we also should recognize that AI represents an opportunity for us to look at the many challenges that we are running headlong into as a global community, but also as an Australian community, in terms of, how we fuel, feed, operate, and manage the world that we live in today. And say, well, we have access to this tool. It could help us solve these problems. In doing so, we may encounter some challenges along the way. Is that okay? And it's sort of this, social license to explore and experiment and that we're trying to deal with. For me, what it comes down to is, and this is the work that this is front and center where the National AI Center sits, is, the voluntary AI safety standard was the piece of work that we had in the past, which was sort of this very comprehensive set of things that you should be doing to be safe with AI. And what was born out of that was, yes, it's true, these are very good things to do, but there's too many of them. It's too much. Only the top 5% of any organization in Australia is ever going to be able to do them. And if they do them all, I don't know that creates the balanced environment for them to actually do experimentation, ideation, and creation. So we took that feedback, and we took lots of feedback consultation from industry, and we created the AI6, the Guidance to AI Adoption, which was a much simpler version of that to try and kind of reduce the burden of governance and assurance, but make sure we keep our eyes on the most concerned areas, which are, loss of human autonomy, bias and unfairness, algorithmic implementations, and the ability to contain issues when and if they occur. So I think there's a level of the right governance, but the thing that has to go hand in hand with this, and this is sort of back to something we said earlier, which is, if building governance doesn't solve the problem, building assurance frameworks doesn't solve the problem, it creates a place where we have some degree of conformity and normality around, and consistency around how we are doing things. But you still need to invest in our ability to use these tools in a safe and appropriate way. So what it comes down to is this issue of our skills and knowledge in the technology, but also not just in the depth of the technology, but the ways in which we should use it to kind of, just because you can, you shouldn't, doesn't mean you should. And then some consistent rules by which we follow that make sure that we're all kind of, making sure that we're just minimizing those risks of harm. So you need to do both of these things. So you have an assurance models that say, hey, make sure you've got autonomy, make sure you've got your data governance, make sure you've got processes in place. And then you've got literacy, skilling, and this sort of fluency that says, now learn about the technology, because if you learn about it, what you won't do is you won't inadvertently do something with it that is dangerous. And I don't want to oversimplify it, because I'll get blasted by any of your listeners, but there's this idea that, AI causes harm. We often see the headlines that will say that AI did a bad thing. Now, I'm going to tell you that in almost every single example of where AI has done something that has been harmful to a person, it's because a human being made a dumb decision about where AI or how AI should or could be used. Now, there are some obviously very deep and dark and concerning areas of that where AI gets, where chatbots have sort of created very bad, very catastrophic outcomes for people. I think we could all clearly agree that there's kind of some very hard lines that need to be drawn there. But I think if we kind of rise up a bit into the sort of the industry side of things, where someone uses AI to write a paper, and that paper contains hallucinations, and that paper then gets submitted to some business who pays an awful lot of money for it, and then realizes it's full of hallucinations or lies. Like, the actual problem there is that the people who were building that document didn't know to go, hey, this is AI. It creates bad outcomes if we don't double check the resources. We should probably double check the sources. The AI didn't do anything wrong, but human beings inadvertently did not understand it. So that's when I talk about literacy. That's what I mean. It's about knowing how these things work, in the same way that no one will get into a car and drive it down a freeway if they didn't know how the car worked, how to start it, how to stop it, how to take the indicators and look through the mirrors. You just wouldn't do it, or you'd be crazy to do so. And that's the same logic here, is that, like, if you're going to use AI, you've got to know how to start it, how to stop it, where the mirrors are, and how to signal properly with it. And that combined with assurance, and then, that will build the basis for us, I think, to kind of start moving to a world where, we regulate appropriately, but also we innovate safely.
Just building on your car analogy, it seems as if the car industry, that process of driving is being automated more and more. Other sectors in the economy, more and more AI agents are being used along the workflow. So there is this interesting question of, if a large proportion or all of a large portion of the workflow, or the entire workflow, is automated by AI agents, who bears the responsibility where things go wrong?
Well, you're edging onto a topic of long, historically written and understood legal, concepts, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm certainly not going to try and comment on that. I mean, you would any layperson would arguably say in any context, whenever a technology is used, it is always the human that is, that ultimately is responsible. And in most cases, it tends to be the person at the top. And so we've seen over the years things like back into the global financial crisis in 2009, that led to and then the collapse of the US mortgage prime system. It led to the creation of the Sarbanes-Oxley rules, which are financial reporting rules, which ultimately put the responsibility on the CEO and the leadership to do these things. And similarly now, as we get into these cyber issues we've seen, and data breaches and data leakage, there's a responsibility that links up. So you would argue that we're not probably ready to give that responsibility to a system that is not in some way human. And philosophically here, I'm personally of the mind that as a species, human beings, we are incapable of recognizing or deferring authority to something outside of ourselves. We are too self-absorbed and self-centered to ever accept the fact that there is something else on this planet that is perhaps better than us, even if we built it. So this is why I think that, when we get into these worlds of superintelligence and AGI and defining an AI system that is, smarter and better than a human being, the singularity, all those kind of things. And I'm a big sci-fi nut. I love all that stuff to read about it. But I think the fundamental problem here is that we have an adverse reaction to the idea that something is better than us. And so therefore, we can't ever accept AGI as a thing. We will never accept it. We will always move the goalposts. And so in your concept of the agentic AI concept and model, even if we solve the problem and agentic AI was safe enough to use in sort of many normalized day-to-day transactional systems, like I no longer have to do my own banking and insurance systems because some agent will just go and figure out the best system for me, buy my policy, knows what I'm worried about, and argues it down to the best price. Wonderful as that sounds, and frankly, that does sound pretty wonderful. I just think we would always still kind of have this ultimate arbitration of system that says, but if it went wrong, the person who built the agent or the business who sold me the system that they're no longer willing to honor, or somebody, some human being has to be responsible. I'm fighting myself here because I'm I love the idea of a world where we have these agentic models and systems that just do all of the drudgery, all of the things that none of us really want to do. And it's not just the personal life. You think about any business that any of your listeners might find themselves in the next 3 to 5 years as they move into the workforce. I'm going to tell you now, there's a good chunk of drudgery in almost every job. Like there's just stuff you do, paperwork process, bureaucracy, the stuff like that. Everyone would love to just hand that off to a system and say, give me back the time to do the things that I actually think are high value. And that maybe the best way to wrap this point is we're probably not going to answer the question about where does the buck stop? And, it's a hard question to answer. But I think what it gets us to is, how do we talk about this going forward? From here now, in this world we exist in, there is an over-reliance on a conversation that is always framed as, how is AI going to take away from me? What is AI going to do to take away from my job? Which jobs are going to be lost by AI? How will my job change with AI? What is the risk of AI taking over and, sort of dehumanizing? These are the conversations we have. I would ask every one of your listeners, when they kind of have that, when they're faced with that question, to just pivot that question and be asking the question, how could I do more with AI? If I'm going to step into becoming I'm going to be a lawyer, if you're looking from a legal point of view, if I ultimately want to be a lawyer, how does AI help me as a lawyer service the needs of more people who need legal services? Like it's this subtle flip of language that is, like I say subtle actually, because in times of great transition and disruption, which is where we're at today, if we kind of take that moment, step back a bit, there's a lot going on. There's two things that matter most in times of great transition and disruption: leadership and language. And good leadership, people that are looking at this opportunity and saying, let's lean into this, let's do this. I'm going to do it as the leader, and I'm giving you permission as the team to do it. And the language we use to describe it. If we continue to ask ourselves the question and produce reports and invest money in trying to understand how much damage AI will do, I guarantee you AI will do damage. because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We walk towards the catastrophe that we paint in our minds. If we start asking the question, how many more people's lives could we save if we used AI in our medical industry? How many more people would be released from harmful or bad situations if our legal system could service more people? If we ask ourselves these questions and then explore where AI intersects with that, it means that the humans are still kind of centered to this, which they always will be, to our point earlier. And we're not just ignoring this technology, head in the sand, it's too dangerous, it's too scary, and I don't understand it anymore, and it's moved too fast, ergo I'm going to leave it it's not my problem anymore, someone else will deal with it. But we actually grab it by the horns and go, I'm going to learn this thing because I'm going to see what I can do with it, because I have a job to do in this world, which is to, deliver some value to the people of this planet in some other way. And AI should be a way to do that better, at least in my mind.
So you sort of saying the tech inside global giants and now at the heart of government, looking back 10 years from now, what would be the one thing that Australia needs to get right today to ensure we're sort of the leader of AI as opposed to the customer of it?
Yeah, hindsight's a wonderful thing. Look, what I would say is, I hope when I look back at some point, we realize that the limiting factor in our ability to grasp this moment that AI is giving us is not actually in the AI technology. It's in us and our willingness and our capacity to use it to the maximum effect. And I think now if I could look back on that, we've proven over the years, Australia's proven over the years that we are actually an innovator, a leader, an ideator of new things. We're a country that builds scrappy startup type people. We are just good at that. It's part of our psyche. And if we can just get to the point with AI in particular, that it's not always just about more tech, it's actually about how do humans use that tech, and realize that we've got to look at ourselves and figure out what are we doing. We can get past that. Then I think in 10 years time, we could well be one of the centers of AI innovation on the planet.
So Lee, if you were able to tell your 20-year-old self something now, what would that be?
There's a long list of things, but the most important thing I would say to myself, and I say this to my son who's 19, is it's okay not to have all the answers. You don't have all the answers and everything's going to change by the time you get there anyway. Always have your ears open, your mouth ready to speak, but not always speaking, and enjoy the ride. It's going to be fun. It's just going to be something I can't prepare you for because the world is changing constantly.
Thank you, Lee. That was amazing. Really, really appreciate it.